The sun had barely brushed the horizon when Elias Crow stirred awake in the wooden cabin he had built with his own hands decades ago. The walls smelled of pine, smoke, and old leather, everything that had lasted longer than people. Outside, the wind whispered through the skeletal trees, carrying with it the faint scent of wild sage and the dry dust of the plains. For years, Elias had known this silence. It was a companion more loyal than any man, more honest than any woman. Yet, as he stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, he felt a tremor in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. The ranch sprawled across a stretch of rolling hills, broken only by the fence lines he repaired every spring and the corral where a handful of horses waited. Once this place had been alive with laughter, voices, and footsteps. Now, it was a shrine to solitude. He had lived through the war, through fires that devoured villages, through winters that froze the marrow of men's bones. The world had moved on, leaving him behind that a low gust lifted a loose plank from the roof, sending it creaking against the cabin. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. For decades, he had been alone, and yet the feeling of being watched was something he could never shake. Not from men, not from animals, from something else, something unspoken, a shadow of a memory that would not leave him, but he went about his chores with quiet precision. Feed the horses, mend the fence, check the water trough. Every motion had been practiced, honed over years, until they were instinctual. There was a rhythm to life on the ranch, a cadence that matched the beating of his own heart. Yet today that rhythm faltered. A distant sound carried across the plains, a hoofbeat, perhaps, or the faint crunch of someone walking through the dry brush. His gaze snapped toward the horizon, eyes narrowing against the sun. For decades, he had avoided people. Every encounter had ended in betrayal, disappointment, or grief. He had seen love and laughter, but only as an observer, always standing outside the warmth of it. Women, children, neighbors, they were ghosts now. The only faces that haunted him were gone, and he thought he had buried all desire, all hope. But the wind that day carried something different, something alive. That be why mid-morning, a dust cloud appeared at the edge of the property. At first, Elias thought it was a herd of wild horses, though it seemed unlikely so far from the usual ranges. Then he saw them, 6 figures moving as one, their outlines shimmering in the heat. Horses? Perhaps. But as they drew closer, the shapes sharpened into women, tall, strong, confident, and impossibly real. Each carried herself with the weight of a story untold, their boots kicking up dust that glittered in the sunlight like sparks from a distant fire. Elias froze. The years of solitude, the careful barricades he had built around his heart, wavered for the first time. He could not hear their voices, could not yet see their expressions, but something in their presence demanded attention. Not with threat, not with menace, but with an unspoken assertion of life. They were strangers, yes, yet there was an unyielding certainty in the way they approached, as though the world had been waiting for them to arrive at this exact moment. The women dismounted at the corral, horses neighing and stamping against the dry dirt. One of them, a dark-haired woman with a streak of gray, stepped forward. Her eyes met his across the yard, and in that gaze was not inquiry, not pleading, but a quiet declaration. We are here. There is no other way. Her hand rested lightly on the saddle, but the tension in her shoulders suggested she could draw a weapon if needed. Yet she did not. There was no hostility, only presence. Elias lowered his rifle, slowly, deliberately. He had lived decades without the touch of another soul. Yet in that moment, he felt the stirrings of something he had thought long dead. Curiosity, perhaps even longing. The wind picked up again, rustling the cabin's roof and sweeping across the plains. It carried with it the faint smell of leather, sweat, and faint perfume, foreign but not unwelcome. The women began tending to their horses, moving with practiced ease, yet always with an alertness that suggested they were not travelers without purpose. They were here, yes, but why? The day stretched onward, the sun climbing higher, and still the 6 strangers lingered. They did not speak, or if they did, their voices were swallowed by the wind. Each woman carried an air of resilience, scars hidden beneath their clothing and in the set of their jaws. Elias watched as one of them brushed a hand over the corral's gate, her fingers tracing the grooves in the wood as if searching for stories etched into it over years. Another adjusted her hat, tilting it against the sun, while the third knelt beside a horse, checking its hooves. Their movements were silent conversations with the land, and he felt the intrusion not as offense, but as a gentle assertion that life would not wait for him any longer. As night fell, Elias built a fire outside, the flames licking at the cold air. The women gathered at the edge of the circle, giving him space, yet remaining close enough to be seen. One of them caught a spark in the firelight and held it as if it were a token, a silent offering. He could feel their patience, their understanding of boundaries, yet also a quiet challenge. You cannot remain hidden forever. The crackling fire mirrored the tension in his chest, the war between isolation and the sudden, inexplicable pull of connection that he wanted to speak, to ask who they were, why they had come. But his throat was dry, his voice gone. Instead, he watched, and in watching, he felt the first real pulse of life he had experienced in decades. The women's presence was neither threat nor promise. It was revelation. The world, after all, had not entirely moved on. It still had surprises, still had storms, still had sparks capable of reigniting even the coldest embers of a heart thought extinguished. As the first stars appeared, Elias realized that his life, measured in decades of silence and solitude, had reached a turning point. The wind no longer whispered only of loneliness. Now, it carried voices, movement, and the faintest touch of possibility. He did not yet know their names, their stories, or their intentions. But he knew, with a certainty that sent shivers down his spine, that the next days would change everything he had believed about life, about the land, and about himself. And as the 6 women settled near the fire, shadows flickering over their faces, Elias Crow understood something he had long denied. He was no longer alone. The dawn arrived with a gray haze that clung to the hills like a shroud. Elias woke to the sound of hooves shifting in the corral and the faint crunch of gravel under leather boots. The 6 women were already awake, moving quietly with a rhythm that seemed both practiced and natural, as though the land itself whispered instructions only they could hear. He watched them from the cabin's window, noticing small details, the way one of them tugged a frayed strap on her saddle, the other straightening a hat brim against the wind, the third kneeling to inspect the soil near the barn. Every movement had purpose, every gesture measured. Elias stepped outside, boots sinking into frost-hardened dirt. He had survived storms, raids, and the relentless cruelty of men, but the presence of these strangers introduced a tension he had not felt in years. Not fear, exactly, more like a pulse of energy, raw and unshaped, pressing against the walls he had built around himself. One of the women approached. Her steps were soft, deliberate. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and as she drew near, he saw her eyes, gray, stormy, and full of something he had almost forgotten: life. She did not speak, but nodded toward the cabin door, an unspoken invitation or perhaps a challenge. Elias hesitated. Words had not been necessary for decades. Gestures and silences were enough. The day stretched on with work. Together, silently, they began to repair broken fences and mend the barn's roof. Elias noticed that their hands were strong, calloused from labor, yet precise, careful. There was no rush, no clamor for acknowledgement, only movement, shared effort. Occasionally, one of the women would glance at him, and their eyes would meet briefly, holding a question neither dared to voice aloud. By afternoon, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and distant smoke. Elias realized that the weather had shifted abruptly, as though heralding something larger. Clouds swirled above the plains, dark and heavy, and the horses grew restless. He felt a pang of unease, a memory of storms that had torn apart homes, of winds that had carried screams over the mountains. The women seemed unaffected, moving with calm authority, securing the animals and gathering supplies for the night. When the first drops fell, Elias helped bring the horses into the barn, feeling the strange exhilaration of shared work. Silence reigned, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of boots and the soft whinny of the animals. There were no introductions, no questions, but an understanding began to form, fragile and tentative. He realized that trust could be built without words, through acts small and deliberate, gestures of care that spoke louder than any sentence. As the storm raged outside, Elias found himself studying them. Each carried scars, not all visible, but evident in the lines of their faces, the tilt of their shoulders, the way they moved. One had a deep, jagged mark on her wrist, partially hidden by a leather strap. Another bore a faint scar along her cheek, softened by time, but present nonetheless. The others bore their histories more subtly, in quiet resilience, in eyes that seemed to weigh the world carefully before they acted. Night fell, heavy and wet. The cabin's fireplace roared to life, casting flickering shadows across the room. The women gathered near the fire, their faces illuminated by the golden glow. Still, there were no introductions, no explanations. Yet, Elias sensed something deeper in their presence, a shared understanding of survival, of pain endured and overcome. He felt the stirrings of something he had long buried, connection, possibility, a recognition that life could still surprise him. Then, as if the universe had chosen that moment to speak, a letter appeared on the cabin's doorstep. Elias picked it up with tentative fingers. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, and precise, yet his heart faltered as he recognized the name. It was from someone he had lost decades ago, someone whose absence had haunted him through every empty winter and every silent night. The letter carried no reproach, no demands, only a memory, a reminder of the life he had abandoned and the choices he had made. The women watched him as he read, their expressions unreadable but attentive. They did not speak, but their presence provided a strange comfort. They did not intrude. They simply existed beside him, as if sharing the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, and Elias felt the delicate threads of trust begin to weave themselves between him and these strangers. Hours passed. The storm eased, leaving a quiet, dripping world in its wake. The women tended the horses, repaired broken equipment, and prepared a simple meal. Elias joined them, the awkwardness of long years alone melting slowly into the warmth of shared labor. Words were scarce, but glances and gestures carried the language of understanding. He realized that these women were not here by accident. Their arrival had purpose, and he would soon discover what that purpose demanded of him. When night fully descended, Elias stepped outside, looking up at the stars emerging through the clearing sky. He thought of the decades of solitude, of the walls he had built around his life, and of the fragile ember that now flickered within him. For the first time in years, he did not feel entirely alone. The 6 women were still moving quietly around the corral, tending horses, checking fences, preparing for the night. Their shadows stretched long across the plains, and in them he saw the reflection of a world he thought had left him behind. He did not yet know their names, their stories, or their intentions. He did not yet know whether trust could survive in this harsh, wild place. But as he watched them move with quiet purpose, Elias understood that his life was no longer his alone. The presence of these strangers had shifted something fundamental, something he could not yet name, but would soon confront. And for the first time in decades, Elias Crow felt a spark of hope in the emptiness, a fragile sense that the storm of his life might finally meet something brighter on the other side. The night stretched long and heavy over the ranch, a silence broken only by the occasional creak of timber and the distant howl of a lone coyote. Elias Crow had spent decades wrapped in solitude, yet tonight the quiet felt different, charged, alive, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The 6 women moved around the property with effortless coordination, their shadows flickering in the firelight, their eyes alert to unseen dangers. storm clouds gathered again over the horizon, rolling like dark tides across the plains. Elias had faced lightning, freezing snow, and marauding men, but the threat tonight felt different. It was not a storm born of nature alone, nor a raid of bandits from neighboring counties. It was something inside him, something unspoken that demanded action, courage, and choice. One of the women approached him silently, placing a small hand on his shoulder. Her eyes were calm, yet unyielding, a mirror of his own buried resolve. Elias felt a wave of emotion he had not touched in decades. Trust, fear, and the weight of responsibility entwined together. He nodded once, sharply, understanding that the path ahead would test him not with bullets alone, but with decisions he had avoided his entire life. The hours passed in a tense rhythm. The women worked quietly to secure the perimeter, gathering tools, checking supplies, and tending to the horses. Elias felt a strange camaraderie building, a bond that required no words. In their presence, the years of isolation softened, leaving room for instinct, for courage, for action. Then, from the ridge beyond the ranch, a shadow emerged, figures moving against the dim light of the approaching storm. Elias froze, rifle raised, heart hammering. They were not ordinary travelers. He could see the glint of weapons, the intent in their movements. The 6 women formed a silent line beside him, their faces set, bodies tense. Each had scars, yes, but also the strength of someone who had survived unimaginable trials. The first exchange was quiet. Eyes met eyes, unspoken challenges traded in a language older than speech. Then the air erupted. Shouts rang from the ridge as men descended toward the ranch, their boots thudding against the hard-packed earth. Dust swirled, catching the last light of day. Horses neighed and stamped, and the first cracks of gunfire split the night. Elias acted with precision born of decades of survival. Bullets whistled past, cutting the air with a fierce, tangible rhythm. He moved with the women, a coordinated unit despite the brevity of their acquaintance. One disarmed an attacker with a swift motion. Another guided a frightened horse to safety. The battle was short, brutal, and visceral. Dust, sweat, and blood mingled as choices were made in seconds, lives hanging in the balance. Amid the chaos, Elias caught a glimpse of the gray-eyed woman from the first day, standing firm as she protected a fallen comrade. There was no hesitation in her movements, only a quiet determination that mirrored his own. The realization struck him. He had not been truly alone in decades, not really. These women carried courage and purpose that matched, and in some ways exceeded his own. When the last attacker fled, stumbling into the shadows of the plains, Elias lowered his rifle, chest heaving. The ranch was battered but intact. The women gathered near the fire, brushing dust and blood from their clothes. Silence returned, heavy and contemplative. Elias looked around at their faces, 6 strangers who had arrived like a storm and left their mark like sunlight. He felt a strange mixture of relief, awe, and sorrow. Relief that the immediate threat had passed, awe at the resilience and skill of these women, and sorrow for the lives lost in the shadows of the past, for the decades he had spent running from connection. As the fire crackled, Elias realized the truth. Life would never be the same. The ranch was no longer just a place of solitude and survival. It had become a space of possibility, of trust, of shared courage. The women had come into his life not to change him with words or promises, but by their presence, by the quiet strength of their actions, and by the shared endurance of the night's trials. He stepped forward, finally breaking the long silence, and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. They responded with faint smiles, subtle gestures, understanding that no words could capture the depth of what had passed. When the storm clouds finally cleared, stars shimmered above the ranch, reflecting on the wet plains below. The horses grazed quietly. The wind carried whispers of distant mountains, and the first hints of dawn glowed faintly on the horizon. Elias knew that this night, this battle, and this unexpected arrival of 6 strangers had reshaped him. He would never be the man who lived alone for decades. His heart, long hardened, had been touched. His spirit, long confined, had been awakened. And as the six women settled near the fire, shadows flickering and breathing with quiet strength, Elias felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Not the fragile kind, the fleeting hope of a desperate man, but a rooted, enduring hope, forged through survival, trust, and the recognition that connection could exist even in the harshest landscapes. He looked around once more, the embers of the fire reflecting in his eyes, and whispered softly to the wind, to the land, and to the strangers who had become more than that. You've changed everything, and maybe, just maybe, I can change too. The ranch, long a monument to solitude, now held life again. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained. And in the quiet aftermath, amidst the flickering firelight, Elias Crow understood the most profound truth he had ever learned. Even the coldest heart could be warmed, even the loneliest soul could find kinship, and even in a world of dust and ruin, the spark of life and hope could endure.